Craigslist is not something I would use often. I mean, less than once a year for sure. But sometimes it's just the easiest way to sell something that would otherwise be impossible to sell quickly. However, after this happened to me about 3 years ago, I never used Craigslist again. I was 22 at the time and lived in a very small house with a roommate of mine for over a year before he moved out. The lease ended in a few months anyways, and without a roommate to split the rent with, I could no longer afford the property. Thus, I had to move out as well. It wasn't too hard to find an apartment, but it was way smaller than the house was. This meant that I pretty much needed to get rid of all of my furniture. The couch was basically unused, and my roommate and I bought it just over a year ago when he moved in. So it would be a total waste to just put it on the side of the road for someone to pick up. The thing was expensive, and I could really use any extra money to help with the move, so of course I resorted to Craigslist. This was my first time ever selling anything on the site, as I was always the one to buy stuff instead. I'd never had any weird experiences, aside from just the awkward feeling of being in someone else's house and meeting a stranger. Though, being the person selling this time, I felt much more comfortable since I would be at my house. Anyway, it took a bit over 2 weeks for someone who was seriously interested to reply to the ad and ask to come check it out. He ended up calling me to ask a few questions about it. Honestly, it made me feel better, since I assumed he was probably just trying to be safe and make sure I wasn't some creep. His name was David, and he told me that he moved into a new house and needed some cheap furniture to fill the space. I mentioned that I was in the exact opposite position, leaving my house for an apartment. He responded, asking politely why I was leaving, to which I told him that my roommate left, so I couldn't really afford it anymore. He sounded nice though, which I guess made me tell him more than I should have. We set a time after we were both off of work on a Saturday evening around 6 o'clock. When that time came around, I left the front door open and waited. I sat on the couch for over an hour just waiting for the guy to show up before eventually shutting the front door and going to the kitchen to make some food, assuming he just bailed on me. But then the doorbell rang only minutes later. It was 7:30 at this point, so I was obviously a little upset, but I tried to fake a smile and opened the door. "Hey, I'm David," he said as he held his hand out for a handshake. He was a tall, larger man with a very large grin on his face. I shook his hand and invited him inside, showing him into the living room. He looked at it for a second, nodding his head in approval, before I heard footsteps outside the front door, followed by it opening and 2 more men walking inside. "Sorry, these are my buddies that are moving in with me. Hope you don't mind." "Oh, yeah, that's fine," I said nervously, knowing that there wasn't much I could do about it. Honestly, I was starting to get really uneasy though, and had a bad feeling in my gut. I tried to not think about it, telling myself I was overthinking it, but my feelings would not suppress. David walked to the other side of the couch and knelt down a bit as if he was inspecting something. Then he stood back up. "What's this over here?" he said, pointing down at the side of the couch. With the other 2 men standing behind me, I reluctantly walked over to where he was standing and looked down at the couch. "I don't see anything." He pointed again, as if he wanted me to get down and look. The 2 other men came closer, standing in front of me, while David was behind me. Slowly, I knelt down and looked at the side, still not seeing anything. I could feel all of them breathing over me, making me feel powerless and terrified. "I'm just messing with ya. There's nothing there," David exclaimed, giving me a hard pat on the back as I stood up. I let out a nervous chuckle and moved myself a few steps away. I could see the other men had creepy smiles on their faces as they looked at David as if plotting something. I tried my best to remain calm and think of a way out of this situation, but they were in my house. I couldn't just leave, and I was too scared to ask them to leave. "So, do you like it?" I asked, trying to speed up this process. David looked at his friends, and then back at me. His happy, smiling expression had shifted. There was a very odd moment of silence as I stared into David's empty eyes. A calm before the storm. One of the men tackled me to the ground, pinning me down aggressively. My instant reaction to resist was overpowered by his strength, and I gave up quickly, just hoping to not be any further harmed. David and the other man ran through the house, looting it of everything valuable, creating chaos and mess in all of the rooms. The man on top of me continued to hold me tightly, pushing my head into the hard wooden floor with all of his weight. After a few minutes, David called out by the front door, and the man got off of me and ran out of the house. I heard their truck pull out and speed off, as I laid on the ground in shock, pain, and terror. After a couple minutes, I gathered myself up and slowly stumbled to the front door to close and lock it. I called the cops soon after. To no one's surprise, David wasn't his real name, nor was the email or phone number attached to any identifiable person. They collected some fingerprints around the house and took pictures of their shoe prints on the ground, but the case ran cold with no suspects at all. The only thing they were able to identify was that the shoe prints left at my house were the same as ones left at someone else's house a few weeks ago during a similar attack and robbery. That person was also alone in their home. It's suspected that they try to find those who live alone, so obviously I kind of fucked myself over by telling the man about my roommate who had left. Either way, that experience has caused me a lot of stress and anger. I was blinded by the feeling of safety being in my own home and was taken advantage of because of it. Sites like Craigslist are dangerous, and people need to be more aware of the dangers of willingly inviting unknown, seemingly innocent people into their homes. I tried buying a truck off of Craigslist some years ago, and before you say anything, it was a great price and I wasn't in the best financial situation. I'd never actually used Craigslist before, but I knew it was an average place for people to sell their stuff, which meant that it was usually cheap. Even with the cheap prices of cars on the site, I still had to ask my dad for money because I didn't even have the few $1,000s in my account that I needed in cash for a cheap car. After a bit of scrolling though, I messaged this guy who posted his truck for $4,000, and he got back pretty quickly, answering all of my questions on it and giving what sounded like honest answers. He basically said that it wasn't the nicest looking, but it'll get you where you gotta be in a reliable manner. Interested, he agreed to meet me at a Burger King that was a halfway point of where we both lived. I got there first, taking an Uber, and he showed up maybe 5 minutes later. We chatted for a bit, and he told me more about the truck, mentioning minor issues it's given him in the past, but nothing too serious. After all, I didn't have the money to be picky. Of course, I asked if I could test drive it, to which he said that he knew a less busy parking lot and I could test drive it there. Honestly, I was like, alright, whatever, and I took my phone out to get a quick Uber, but he said it was just across the street and that we could just ride together. I didn't want to be rude and had never done something like this before, so I kind of assumed it was a normal thing. Looking back, I should have told him to F off, but I was young and he was old, so for some reason I trusted him. As I got inside, he asked me if I had my license on me, which was just another reason I trusted him. He seemed like he was a genuine guy. He started driving, though we went a little further than across the street, probably a few blocks away from the Burger King to this empty parking lot away from the main road, which was the first red flag to come up, even though it should have been the second or third. Alright, let's switch, he said, putting the car in park. As we were passing each other around the car, he threw me the keys, saying heads up, but they landed nowhere near me. I mean, I would have had to dive into the concrete to catch them. Awkwardly, I went to pick them up, and just as I bent down, I felt the weight of his foot slam against my side, and before I knew it, he was on top of me, ripping my wallet out of my back pocket and running back towards the truck. I immediately grabbed the keys from the ground, thinking he must have forgotten them in the heat of the moment, and that I could possibly force a trade. Unfortunately though, the keys he threw at me must have just been fake, because he just drove away, leaving me stranded there stupidly. What makes everything worse is that it all happened so fast I couldn't even get the damn license plate. I still had my phone though, and the first thing I did was cancel the only card I had, because I couldn't risk him spending money I didn't have, and then I called the police. I walked back to the Burger King and filed a report when they met me there. But with only the description of a rusty white truck and an average middle-aged white guy, Nothing ever came of it. He took the ad down, and his email wasn't even a real name. Apparently it was just named after a video game character. And again, I didn't get his plates. So all in all, I lost $4,000 of straight cash, had to wait for a new card in the mail, had to get a new license, and they didn't even catch the guy. Moral of the story is, don't use Craigslist, and don't be as stupid as I was. I used to work for a big maid company, but I left after my ex-coworker told me that she was making more than triple just working by herself and listing ads on Craigslist Marketplace. So of course, I looked into it, and eventually began doing that as well. I was making amazing money for close to 7 months before anything weird happened. Ever since, I have never encountered someone that creepy, and I hope I never do again. I had answered a usual email from someone asking me to clean their house. The way it works is they tell me what rooms they want me to do, and I charge the price based on how long I think it will take. To do this, I have to go to their house to make an estimate, or they can send me a video walkthrough. This is the way we did it at my old company, except I charge a much better price, and people feel more comfortable with the same person coming over every week. The man had sent me a video walkthrough of his house, and it was very clean already, which happens with a lot of clients who just want to maintain that cleanliness and have someone get the nitty-gritties. We set a date and time, and a few days later I went for the first time clean. I was going to be there for about 3.5 hours, doing the top and bottom floor, no basement, and giving extra care to the kitchen and bathroom tiles. He greeted me at the door and led me upstairs so I can work my way down, and this is where everything went to shit. I began cleaning, expecting him to leave, but he kind of just stands there watching me, which I sometimes have happen with older women who are control freaks, but this guy wasn't looking at what I was cleaning. He was eyeing me. I ask him if he wants me to do anything else, and he just stands there for a second. You know, when I saw your ad on Craigslist, I knew I had to have you. At first, I didn't think of this in any kind of flirty way. I just saw this as some older white guy telling me, a Mexican woman, that I was meant to be good at cleaning. I didn't really care. I've heard it all the time. They usually just say things out of ignorance. But I wanted the money, so I kept my mouth shut and faked a response. Oh, well, thank you. I usually ask that people stay out of the room though, it's just easier to clean that way. He said no problem, but clearly there was, because while he left that room, he went to the room just across the hallway and sat on the bed and watched me from there. At this point, I was getting creeped out, and the thought of him watching me for 3.5 hours was very unsettling. I had an idea, and after I dusted, I started to vacuum, going behind the door so I could move it, leaving it only cracked open slightly, so that for the rest of this room at least, he wouldn't be able to look at me. I just had to get through this day, get paid, and never come here again. I moved to the bathroom that was connected to the room. I was about 20 minutes in and scrubbing grout when I felt that I was being looked at again. I turned around and sure enough, he was there in the doorway. Sorry to bother you. I forgot to tell you to leave the vanity as is. It was my wife's. She died years ago in '09. It's been really rough going through all that, so I want to preserve it. I said okay, and after a moment of silence and awkward staring, he finally laughed. I wondered why he didn't just put in special instructions to not touch the master bathroom vanity if it were so important. But as I was cleaning around it, I noticed there was some makeup on the counter that I knew had only come out a few years ago. This was 2017, and he said his wife died in 2009, but the makeup lying on the counter had a few products that came out no earlier than 2015. And I knew this because I was excited when they came out. And for what it's worth, if this vanity had been preserved, it would have looked a lot worse. If I wasn't sketched out before, I definitely was now. Thankfully, for the rest of the time I was upstairs, he didn't look at me or talk to me. I was dreading going downstairs, but I was halfway done and just needed to get the rest of it over with. I got to the kitchen and started there. From the kitchen, you could see the living room, and again, something was off. This guy had 0 pictures hanging up. I've cleaned so many homes, hundreds at this point, and I've never seen a house with no pictures. Even people that lived alone had at least holiday cards of other people's families on their fridge. I don't know why it freaked me out so much, but it did, and right when I decided I was just gonna do the rest really fast and cut some of the cost for him, he appeared in the archway and asked if I could do him a favor. I hesitantly asked what, to which he said he knows it specifically says no basement, but he forgot he's having guests over next week, and that was where the pool table and everything was, and he just wants it quickly vacuumed. I told him I was on a really tight schedule and wasn't sure if I could do it today, but maybe next time. He then said I could skip the dining room because it's never in use and just do the basement floors instead. I responded, explaining that I could come back tomorrow and do the whole basement instead of just the floors if he wanted, just trying to push it off a little bit. But this was when his whole demeanor changed. He started to get really weird and said that he just wants the floor done and he couldn't understand why I wouldn't just do it today. He went on to say that he and his wife really needed the floors done down there. His wife, the one that had died years ago. That was the moment I realized that this guy was clearly trying to do something horrible, but I didn't know what. I told him, if I have time I will. Well, can I just show you what needs to get done down there? It won't take long, just really quick. Knowing he wasn't going to stop, I pretended to get a phone call, so I went to the other room. I then called my friend to explain what was happening. He was still watching me carefully, so I spoke in Spanish, praying he didn't know any. She agreed to drive to this address and make sure when I left he didn't try to follow me, or worse. I got off the phone and told him that I had a family emergency and I could come back tomorrow to finish everything, which was obviously a lie. He looked at me with the coldest look on his face and replied, "Don't bother." Then he walked upstairs while I gathered my things. I knew I wasn't going to get paid, but at this point I just felt lucky to leave. My friend got there while I was loading my trunk, and the guy was staring at me through the window the entire time. I left, and when I got home I called the police to tell them what happened, but there wasn't much they can do, since he didn't break the law, he was just being creepy. They basically just told me the obvious, to not go there again, which I clearly wasn't going to. Just a reminder for everyone, if you provide a service through sites like Craigslist, there's no sure way to tell who's weird and who's not. So make sure to trust your gut and always let someone know the address you're going to and when you're supposed to leave, just in case. I don't know what was wrong with that guy or what he had planned for me in that basement, but I hope nobody else has to find out. I was using Craigslist as a means of selling some of my old, unused things I had stashed away in my house. I had plans to move out in the next few months, so I was just trying to organize what I needed from what I didn't need, and that's when I found my old motor tools. They were high quality and still functional, but I had gotten battery-powered ones to replace them not long ago. With no use for them anymore, I took a couple pictures and posted them up on Craigslist. I had listed a power drill, driver, and matching tool set for $80. Considering they weren't that old and still fully functional, this was a really good deal. It didn't take long to get responses. In just an hour, I got 2 replies to my post. One of them emailed me asking if $50 would be okay, but I politely declined. The other reply stated that they were very interested and wanted to buy them that same night for the listed price. I agreed and said I was available at 5 if he wanted to swing by and pick them up. I never let anyone into my house when selling things. I'd always just bring the stuff out to my driveway and talk to them there. It was a well-trafficked neighborhood street, so I wasn't worried about anyone attempting something out in the open. As I usually did, I was going to stand out in the driveway with the items a bit before 5 and wait for them so that I could make the transaction as quick as possible. But just past 4:30, there was a knock at the door. I looked out, seeing a man standing there with his red car parked in the driveway. I opened the door a crack, asking who he was. The man said he was here to buy the tools that were on Craigslist and admitted to being early. I told him to hold on for a minute and to just wait in his car, as I wasn't expecting him yet. He hesitated, making the interaction more awkward than it should have been, but then he turned around. Once he walked away, I got all the tools together and met him at the top of the driveway. I had an outlet outside for him to test the tools with, and he seemed satisfied with them. "About 20, he said while holding the drill. The deal was 80. I could do a little lower, but 20 is too low, I said nicely, though I was slightly annoyed because he had already agreed to pay $80 for them, and $20 was just a total rip-off. He put the drill down, and without even looking at me, he walked back to his car and drove away. I was confused and upset, feeling like I'd been played and just had wasted my time. I got the tools back inside and just went on with my night, trying not to let myself get too upset about it. Really, it was just a small inconvenience. At least, that's what I thought. A couple hours later, I walked by the front windows, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw that same red car. It was parked just down the road, 3 houses away from mine. I looked closely, trying to be sure that it was that same man, but nobody was inside it. It was an empty parked car, so I had no way of knowing for sure. I convinced myself it was just a coincidence and carried on. Another hour would go by. I was just going on with my night, making food and watching TV, but then someone knocked on my door. I was a little shaken, but chose to ignore it and hope that whoever it was would go away. Obviously, the man from earlier was my first thought. Only 30 seconds passed before they knocked again. "Hey, it's me. I decided I'll take the tools. I brought the money," he yelled from the other side of the door. I didn't believe him at all. It all came together in my mind that that car that I'd seen an hour ago was his, meaning that he'd been stalking my house all night. I didn't respond and instead called the police, informing them of the man's name and the car he had. The man called out several more times, saying he wanted to buy the tools, but then it went silent for a minute. I was still standing by my couch, looking toward the front door. Another minute passed. I wasn't sure what to do. The police were already on their way and would be here any minute, so I felt safe enough to be able to check out the windows. I quietly walked over to the window that was beside the door. But then suddenly, I heard something hit the side of the house with great force. The sound was followed by leaves rustling and footsteps running away. I looked out the window and saw the guy running with a limp down to his car. The police turned in at the perfect time though, stopping him halfway. It surprised me to hear that the man admitted to a lot. He said he planned on robbing me, but I wouldn't let him into the house, which complicated things for him. Additionally, he tried climbing the tree on the side of my house and jumping onto the roof, but he missed, hitting the side and falling on his leg. The thing is though, he was armed with a knife, and the roof he tried to jump on was just under my second-story window, which after checking, was unlocked. So, if he had made the jump, he actually would have gotten inside. He claimed it was just an attempted robbery, but claims are just that. I stopped using Craigslist, and even to this day, I lock every single window in my house, even the ones that I think are unreachable. I used Craigslist many years ago to find a room for rent. I was looking for a house to stay at and be able to split rent with a roommate or roommates. It took maybe a week to find a place that was suitable for me, and several phone calls with the owner before I was ready to move in. The owner, who was to be my roommate, seemed like a really normal, nice guy who was similar in age as me. He told me all about the place and what to expect, and I also felt like we connected well. With everything seeming perfect, I was getting really excited. I didn't have much to move, so I packed it all up and stuffed it in the trunk of my car, and in just a few days, I drove out 30 minutes to my soon-to-be home. It was located outside of the main town and in more of a woodsy terrain. It had a long driveway leading far from the road. Pulling in, though, it was not as I'd expected. It was a very old, wooden home. I knew it was passed down from his parents, but this place looked to be at least 100 years old. The pictures of the inside that I'd seen on Craigslist looked to be fairly modern, so I assumed they had to have done some pretty big renovations. I packed everything in my car as I went up to the door and knocked. Aaron, the owner, came and showed me around. While the outside was not so impressive, the inside was the opposite. Very well maintained, clean, and definitely had been renovated not long ago. I was really happy with everything and moved my things in that night. Several days went by with no issues. It didn't even feel like I'd found this place on Craigslist. It felt like I was just living with a friend. Aaron worked in town though, so he was gone most of the time, and I worked from home, so I got to have the whole house to myself. Well, not the whole house. There was one door that was always locked. It wasn't any of my business, and I knew that, so I never brought it up with Aaron. But it still got me wondering. It was almost definitely the basement door, but this was odd because he said the house was a one-story home, not mentioning anything about having a basement. Another couple days went by before something happened. Aaron brought home some fast food for dinner and then went to bed early because he had work the next day. I stayed up a while longer, then did the same. Laying in bed though, I had trouble falling asleep. There wasn't any reason for this, it was just one of those nights. But after a while, I heard Aaron's bedroom door open. I was listening because there was nothing else to do, but no sounds came. I waited a whole 2 or 3 minutes before he started walking, slowly, down the hall towards my door. Just as he was passing though, he stopped. I heard the floorboards creak, followed by the door thump softly, as if he was pressing up against it. He stayed there behind the door for a while. I don't even know how long, but then he walked away. Not back toward his room, but the other way, toward the main hallway. Then a door opened and closed. I didn't know what to think. It was really weird and creepy, but also I'd known Aaron for a while now and didn't see him as a weird person. But what was he doing? And where did he go? I stayed awake as long as I could, waiting to hear him come back, but he never did. Over the next few nights, I noticed a pattern. Every time I would go to bed, about 30 minutes later, Aaron would open his door, stand still for a minute, then walk to my door, stand still again, then leave and go into the locked door. He never slept in his room. He always slept somewhere behind the weird locked door. What made it so creepy was that he was trying so hard to keep a secret from me. I decided one night that I was going to figure this all out because I was beginning to feel unsafe. I went to bed and waited for Aaron to do his usual routine. He opened his bedroom door and walked over to mine. Then, as soon as I heard him unlock and open the other door, I got up and quickly went into the hallway, catching him standing by the open door. He looked back at me, clearly startled. "Hey, is everything okay, Aaron?" I asked. He just stared at me, eyes still open wide from the scare I gave him. "Why do you keep going to that door every night?" I broke the silence, getting impatient. We were standing on opposite sides of the long dark hallway, but I could sense that something was wrong with him. We stared at each other still, and I took a step closer. Aaron. As soon as I spoke his name, he ran around the corner and straight to the back door, opening it and continuing to run for the trees. I looked out the back door, seeing him disappear into the dark woods. I was shaking, horrified at what just happened. I have no words to describe the unknown thoughts running through my head. I closed the back door, then grabbed a knife from the kitchen and walked over to the door Aaron had opened. It was in fact a basement, but there was no light switch and it clearly had not been renovated like the rest of the house. The walls were old, decaying wood. I debated whether or not to go down. I was so intrigued and curious, but terrified as well. The longer I stood there, the more afraid I became. I turned and ran back to my room, packed everything I could into 2 suitcases, stuffed them in my car, and drove away, never looking back. I never talked to Aaron again, and he never tried to contact me either. I didn't know what was going on with him, or what he was doing in that house, but I didn't want to be involved. After a while, I forgot about it, but almost 5 years later, I found myself wondering about it again. I looked up the house online and found some strange things. It had been torn down years ago. There was an article from 5 years ago, just a few months after I left, stating that the house was abandoned. To me, this meant that when Aaron ran away that night, he never came back. I kept reading, and it stated that the house was torn down due to what they described as criminal findings. It didn't go into any more detail about what those criminal findings were. This really had me shaken up for a few weeks. Things like this probably wouldn't happen nowadays, but you can never be too careful. I'm a 25-year-old male, and this happened to me 3 years ago. I had just signed a lease for a small house in the town I lived in. Having been living in an apartment for a few years, I didn't have a lot of furniture or large house decorations to fill the space in my rental. While I had a decent-sized couch and TV stand, I only had a mini TV that I wanted to put up in my bedroom since it was so small. Not having a ton of money to work with though, I took to Craigslist to find a larger TV for the living room. I found a few nice flat-screen TVs listed on the site. They were all over my budget though, and honestly, a lot nicer than I actually needed. I just wanted a large TV to fill the space in my living room. I didn't actually care about the quality of the picture on the TV. Anyway, I finally found one that seemed to work with what I needed. It was cheap, large, and was said to be in working condition. It was an old flat-screen TV from probably 10 years ago. Compared to today, they aren't even considered flat screens anymore, as they're usually 3 to 4 inches thick and really heavy. I sent the owner an email and continued with my search. Finding nothing else worth looking into, I just hoped for the best with that one TV. It wasn't until the following morning that I received a response to my email. The owner introduced himself as Mitch and said he'd love to show me the TV whenever I was available. I don't know if I just read it in a weird way or what, but he seemed to be over the top excited about this. It made me a little uncomfortable, but I just figured it was a happy old man or something. I said I could do any day this week after I got off work at 6, and Mitch said tomorrow at 6:30 would be perfect for him, leaving his address at the bottom of the email, along with a Google Calendar invite to an event labeled as Craigslist TV. I accepted it, though I wasn't really sure what the purpose of it was, and it was definitely not a normal thing people do, but it didn't affect me in any way. I got my truck emptied out, and the next day I went to work, then went straight to his address afterwards. It was dark out by now, and when I pulled into his driveway, I saw all the lights were on inside. I checked one last time to make sure I had all the cash on hand, then got out of my truck and went to the front door. Walking up, I could see that the front door was partially open. There was no screen door or anything, just one main door. Thinking it was left open for me, I leaned over and peeked inside, but didn't see anyone, so I rang the doorbell. Right when the bell rang, I heard something drop on the far end of the house. Then it went quiet. There was something about that noise that made me start getting nervous. After a moment, I decided I had a bad feeling about this and was just going to leave. But then footsteps came from behind the door, which then opened slightly wider, revealing a man. "Need something?" he said, half his body still behind the door. "Oh, yeah, I was here to look at your TV. We scheduled for 6:30 today." The man looked at me for a second. "All right." He opened the door completely and let me inside. I will say, at that moment I knew something was wrong. He wasn't acting at all like he was in the emails. I expected a happy old man, not a large, grumpy, middle-aged dude, but I was already inside by the time all the alarms were going off in my head. The TV was in the room right next to the door, so he stood there while I looked at it. Yeah, this looks good. I'll take it," I said, not even knowing if it worked or not, but I wanted to get this over with quickly. I held out the money. He looked at it for a moment, then back at me. He reached out and took it, then shoved it in his pocket, and without giving me any time to react, he grabbed me by the shoulder and shoved me back towards the door, yelling at me to leave. I didn't argue, sprinted out to my truck and drove away. Not long after, I pulled to the side and called the police to let them know I'd been robbed. The whole time I was just thinking about how stupid they were, meeting me at their own house, robbing me, and letting me go, knowing that I knew where they lived. But when the police got to the house and called me back, I was in complete shock hearing what they told me. Over that week, though, things became more clear. The man I met at the house was not Mitch. Mitch, the owner of the house, was found unconscious in the kitchen. Thankfully he survived, though he had some pretty bad injuries. The man I met at the door was another customer Mitch was meeting from Craigslist to pick up some kitchenware he was also selling. He ended up beating and robbing Mitch, likely just minutes before I showed up. What's even crazier is that Mitch had sent that man a Google Calendar invite as well, and the man accepted it, probably unknowing that I showed his email, which just so happened to be his first and last name. He was caught within a few days. During this whole case, I got to actually meet Mitch, and he was indeed a happy old man, even despite what happened to him. I was 16 and looking for a new gaming PC to buy on Craigslist. I had just gotten my first job and wanted to treat myself after my first paycheck. I was online pretty much every day after work, scrolling through any new listings until one of them looked good. It was a 3-year-old Alienware with some decent specs, listed for only $200. In the description, it said they had recently upgraded to a newer PC and had no use for this one, but that it still works just fine. I sent him an email and he got back to me quickly. We exchanged a few back and forth messages before agreeing to meet up the next day. He told me to meet him at a specific grocery store parking lot at 8 p.m. It was kind of far, so I suggested somewhere else that we can meet halfway, but he made a bunch of excuses as to why he couldn't. He said he was going to be busy all week it wouldn't be able to drive very far, so if I wanted it, I'd have to pick it up near him. Although finding it a little annoying, I still thought the deal was worth it and agreed to pick it up. In the morning, I thought about it some more and almost decided to call it off, but then he sent me a few videos to show that the PC was working and also said that if there were any issues, he would refund me, so it made me feel better about it. I went through with it, driving 35 minutes to the grocery store that he said to meet at. Right as I pulled into the parking lot, I saw a truck in the far back. It was the only car in the whole parking lot, and the grocery store's lights were off, like it was already closed. I had thought the whole point of meeting at a grocery store was because it was a safe, public place, so this was kind of defeating the purpose. Having already driven almost 40 minutes though, I still pulled in and hoped it would go smoothly. I parked by his truck and got out. The man sitting inside leaned over and looked down from his window. He didn't smile or greet me or anything. He just looked down like he was inspecting me, which was a really uncomfortable feeling. Then he got out. He was an older guy, like late 40s or 50s. He had brown hair that was thinning in the front, and just from a quick look at him, you could tell there was something wrong. I stood a few feet away, trying to keep my distance as he walked around and opened the back door. Inside, I could see the computer sitting on the seat, but not the one closest to us. It was on the other seat, further inside the truck. He then pointed into the truck and said I could take it out and look at it. His hand was still on the door, and he just watched me, waiting for me to crawl in and grab it. I stood there awkwardly for a second as my eyes moved between him and the truck, before I noticed a small detail. The handle on the inside of the door that he was holding open was missing. It wouldn't take a genius to assume what this was. I started backing away from him and hurried into my car. He yelled at me to come back, but I pulled out right away. The guy rushed into his truck, and instead of following me, he drove off in the other direction. There's absolutely no doubt that if I'd crawled into his back seat, he would have slammed the door behind me. With no handle on the inside, it was obvious it was a trap. Unfortunately, all I had was his email to send to the police, but there was no tracing it. I just hope nobody else falls for his disturbing Craigslist scam. I've checked a few times since then to see if his ad was back up for the PC, hoping to set him up with the police or something. So far, I haven't seen anything, but he could just be using a different alias and trying to scam with a different item. My advice is to stay away from Craigslist. I was using Craigslist to find a condo or room in a house to live in for a few months. Most normal apartments only have 1-year leasing terms, but Craigslist was full of private owners renting out their places or rooms. Usually they were cheaper, and the owners were more willing to negotiate on the length of the lease. I had about a month to search, and I found and viewed a few places, but they all backed out last minute. Then I found another one, looking about the same as all the others. It was a room for rent in a home 20 minutes from me. The person listing it was a 22-year-old young guy. After reaching out, we texted back and forth for a few days before booking a time for me to view the room. When I drove out there and got to the street his address was on, I definitely felt a little less excited. The houses looked like they were barely standing, or just not taken care of at all. Lots of yards were overgrown and even had junk in their front lawns. I guess this is what you get when you can't afford anything better though. I hoped maybe the one I was viewing would be a little more taken care of, but when I parked in the driveway of the home, it looks like all the rest. I still figured I'd give it a shot while I was here, so I got out and pressed the doorbell. It didn't work, so I knocked. Immediately, heavy footsteps came up to the other side of the door. There was a really uncomfortable pause, like maybe a whole 15 seconds. Then he opened it just a crack. I could only see half of his face as he asked me my name. I nervously smiled and answered. Then he opened it all the way and welcomed me inside. He was tall and somewhat thin, with shoulder-length hair and some tattoos showing on his neck. But it was obvious that he was not in his 20s. He was at least mid-30s, maybe even older. I was already standing inside the house at this point though, and he was leading me through the hallway. The man was actually moving really fast, like he was trying to show me everything in a hurry and talking non-stop, which made it hard for me to think too long about anything or realize how odd the situation was. The kitchen was very old and beat up. Some of the cabinets were partially open and loosely hanging on their hinges. He only spent a few seconds in there before moving into the next hallway that had 2 doors in it. He went up to the first and turned to face me. "This one will be your room," he said, opening the door and gesturing to me to have a look. This was when I finally had a moment to catch my breath and think about this. I figured it was probably best just to continue through with the tour, since I was already in the home, and then obviously never come back. But as I stood there, having only hesitated for maybe 3 or 4 seconds though, the man suddenly got angry. Like his face and whole demeanor instantly changed. He didn't say another word, but started walking toward me. I quickly backed away, to which he matched my pace and started moving quicker in my direction. I turned and sprinted down the hallway. As I left the house, I heard him stop at the front door and slam it shut behind me. I felt so stupid for having even entered the home, after already realizing that things were not adding up. I know technically nothing happened, but everything was pointing to an awful outcome. After that, I was too terrified to even try Craigslist again. I live on the East Coast. There's a lot of homesteads around here, or just in general, off-grid cabins and houses. Some of them aren't fully off-grid, but they're just far out and on large properties with 40+ acres of land. It's normal around here to buy used tools and equipment from neighbors or others in the area. At the time, I was doing construction on my property and was in need of a flatbed trailer for my truck so I could haul more materials from the hardware stores. These are absurdly expensive, but since almost everyone around here has them, there's a lot of used ones people want to get rid of. Craigslist was the first and only site that I checked on. There were actually a bunch for sale, and I sent out multiple emails. Only one of them replied though, and we scheduled a good time for me to stop by. All I really knew going into it was that his name was Devin, and that he had what I needed. Again, this was a super common thing around here that I'd done a million times before, so I had no worries going into it. I drove about an hour from my place through mostly national forest roads, until I made it to his driveway. It was like most around here, just a thin gravel road into the woods. I drove through and up to his house. It was a very small and really old-looking wooden cabin with a clearing in the trees leading up to it. The thing that I first noticed, though, was that there was no flatbed trailer on the property. I mean, it's a huge thing. It couldn't just be hiding behind a tree or something, so I expected to see it right when I pulled in. The only thing I could think of was that there must be a garage or shed in the back that he kept it in. Anyway, I parked in the grass and got out. I stood there for a few seconds to see if he'd come out and meet me, but he didn't. So I walked up to the porch and knocked on the door. While waiting, I couldn't tell if any of the lights were on inside. The curtains were covering the windows and the sun was still setting, so it was too hard to tell. After waiting for a whole minute, though, nobody had come to the door, and I started to feel like nobody was even home. Then I got a text. It was from Devin, saying to come around to the back of the cabin where he had the trailer at. I felt something off about it, but also I did assume that I might be kept in the backyard, so I walked around to at least have a look. When I looked around the corner, all I saw were trees. I walked a bit further, stopping on the side of the cabin just before reaching the back. There wasn't even a clearing behind the cabin. It was just woods, going as far as I could see. I'd had enough at this point. I started walking back to my truck, but suddenly heard something behind me. I turned and looked at the woods again, not seeing anything. What I heard sounded like someone approaching from just around the corner. I continued walking, quickening my pace, before hearing loud footsteps pushing through the grass behind me. I only caught a small view of the guy charging at me before I'd booked it from my truck. I don't know if he gave up right away or had something else in mind or what, but when I got in and looked back at the cabin, the guy was gone. I got out of there and drove to the nearest town where I got in contact with the police. The short of it is that the state didn't even know about any cabin built on that land, as it was supposed to be an unoccupied parcel. When they investigated, it was clearly abandoned. With there obviously being no intent to sell me anything, the guy was definitely setting me up for some kind of harmful intent. My guess is that he was hiding along the back wall of the cabin, waiting to jump me as soon as I came around. Luckily, I knew something was up and didn't walk all the way back there. If I had, who knows where I'd be right now. When I was 20 years old, I lived in a very small one-bedroom apartment that I'd moved into when I turned 18. Having a better job and more money in the bank, I decided to rent a small house and leave the apartment. It wasn't anything fancy, but it had more space and was a nice step up from where I used to live. The only thing I didn't account for was that everything looked off once I set it up. Coming from the apartment, my furniture was way too small and didn't match the interior of the home. It just looked like I moved into a house larger than I could afford. So, over the next couple months, I saved up more money and put it aside to buy new furniture. And during these months, I also listed a whole bunch of stuff on Craigslist to start getting rid of. Aside from the couch and a couple other things, I listed most of the dressers, storage shelves, and other large furnishings for free. I didn't care about getting paid, so long as they were able to help me haul it out of my house. I sold and gave away most of the items until only 2 things were left. my old bedroom dresser, and a nightstand, which nobody seemed to want. After a month, though, someone finally contacted me about them. They asked if both of them were still available and if they were actually free. I said yes to both, and we agreed on a date for pickup. On that day, I didn't get home from work until an hour before the time they were supposed to come. But when I pulled up to my house, there was a truck in the driveway. I went up beside them and looked in the window, but nobody was inside. I opened the garage and parked, then went back outside to further inspect the random truck in my driveway. When I looked this time, though, someone was in the car. They waved and got out, introducing themselves as the person from Craigslist, here to pick up the furniture. I took a second to react, because I was trying to figure out where they were when I pulled in. "You're an hour early," I said to me at 7:30. He said he was sorry, but something came up so he needed to come early. I still didn't understand why he didn't text me before coming unannounced, but since he was here, I showed him inside. He looked at the items for a second and said he'd take them. I helped him haul out the large dresser and put it in his truck bed. We went back in for the nightstand, but as he picked it up, a shuffling sound came from downstairs, followed by a quiet thump. I looked down the staircase, then back at the man, who was now looking at me in a very unsettling way. "Everything okay?" he said, in a very monotone voice. I hesitantly nodded and walked downstairs, showing him out. I closed the door behind him and watched out the window to make sure that he left. That whole interaction was very odd from beginning to end, but what I found after was horrifying. Later that night, I saw a small streak on the wall just outside one of the downstairs closets, like someone had brushed against it. I looked around some more, finding very faint shoe prints inside the closet. Someone had clearly been hiding in there. I put two and two together, and I was pretty sure there was another person in my house, along with the man. They broke in before I got home from work, and when they heard me pulling into the driveway, one of them hid in the closet while the other went back to the car. The shuffling sound I heard toward the end was likely the other person leaving the closet. I had the police do what they could, but the two men seemed to cover up their tracks. I gave them descriptions of the one man I saw and the truck he was driving, but that was that. It was a terrible experience, and after that, I only used Craigslist when I could avoid meeting at my house. Otherwise, I would just donate things or buy stuff off eBay. It feels like nowadays, anyone can do anything and get away with it so easily, as long as they plan ahead. Back in the day, around 8 years ago, Craigslist was a very normal service I used every time I had something to sell or needed something to buy on a budget. I lived in a nice town and was mostly okay with meeting new people and doing a quick exchange. At the time, I was looking for a treadmill or an elliptical. Both of these were really expensive to buy new, but used ones in good condition were often sold on Craigslist, sometimes for just a couple $100. I scrolled through a few posts and found one I liked the look of. I sent the seller a message, and the following day they replied. The seller, Mike, assured me the treadmill was in like-new condition, and we arranged to meet later that day. The address he gave me was on the edge of town, just 20 or so minutes away. When I pulled up, I was surprised to see that it was a farmhouse with a huge lot of land surrounding it, but no crops or anything. I drove down the long driveway and parked in the front yard next to several other trucks and cars that were in the yard. Mike was outside on the porch smoking when I walked up. He shook my hand and led me around the back of the house to his garage, where the treadmill was set up right in the middle, plugged in and everything. He leaned against the far wall and encouraged me to test it out. I got on and put it on a walking speed. It seemed to be working just fine, but then I turned it up a little and it just shut off. I looked at it confusingly, and before I could even figure out what happened, the garage door suddenly fell down behind me, slamming against the ground. It was so loud, my heart was racing from the jump scare it gave me. I turned and looked at Mike, who shrugged and apologized, saying it was an old garage and it happened sometimes. I looked back and a cold shiver ran through me, noticing the position I was in. "So, did you want it?" No, I don't think it works." I was nervous to give that answer, but there was no way I would pay for that. He looked at me without saying anything. After a second, I broke eye contact, feeling a strange tension. "Not a problem. I'll show you out," he said, waving me to follow him through the house. With no other way out, I followed. The house was very old-looking on the inside, like a farmhouse from the 1900s, except it was really messy. Stuff was piled up all around the walls and even blocking some of the hallways. He walked me down to the front door and stopped right in front of it. There was a long pause as he faced the door, not opening it. He then turned to me. "I'm sorry," he said under his breath, like an emotionless psychopath. My body went cold in that moment, knowing something was about to happen. The man quickly stepped toward me, grabbing my arm and forcing me back, deeper into the house. I started yelling, fighting his grip and trying to get away. He pushed me down the hallway, almost back to the garage door, until I suddenly tripped over one of the random things that were piled up. When I fell, he lost his balance too, falling past me. I quickly got up and ran down to the front door, unlocking it and running to my truck. As I backed out, the man came rushing out of the front door and sprinting at my truck. I was able to get away, but my hands were shaking on the steering wheel all the way home. I of course notified the police, but things didn't go how I expected. When they got there, nobody answered the door at the farmhouse. The man never turned up. The vehicles parked on the lot, though, were all found to be unregistered and missing license plates. However, one of them was identified as a recently stolen car. Whoever that man I met with was, he wasn't the owner of the farmhouse. The owner actually lived in a neighboring city, having inherited the land from their parents. They hadn't had the chance to sell it, so they just used it as a temporary storage or something. This happened many years ago, and the man never turned up, so I know it's a lost cause, but it's still scary knowing he's out there. I don't know what he was trying to do to me back then, or what he still might be trying to do to other people now. I had heard warnings before about using Craigslist, people getting scammed, robbed, or even worse, but I was desperate. I needed a new apartment ASAP, and my budget was tight, so I took a chance and started browsing the housing section on Craigslist. I came across a listing for a small apartment in an old building downtown. The rent was cheap, and the location was perfect for my job. I emailed the owner, and he responded quickly. We discussed the time to meet up, and a couple days later, I drove over there. When I arrived at the apartment building, I couldn't help but feel a bit let down. The old brick facade was crumbling, and the windows were old and dirty, one of them even boarded up. I climbed the stairs up to the second floor, and knocked on the door of apartment 2B. The man opened the door, and I was surprised by how friendly he was. He showed me around the apartment, which was small but still nice. It was in good condition, and I could tell that he put a lot of work into it. He told me he was renovating the whole building, and that the construction noise would only be temporary. We talked some more and discussed the price, and I ended up taking the deal. Later in the week, I moved in and set everything up. Every time I saw the outside of the building, I couldn't believe I was living in a place that looked like that, but I just have to remind myself that it was the inside that counted. 3 weeks went by, no problems or concerns about the place, until I started to realize something. Nobody else seemed to live in the building. I never saw anyone parked outside or walking inside, and I never heard anyone through the thin walls. Additionally, I never heard any construction going on like the owner had said there would be. I kept these thoughts in the back of my mind, until one morning when leaving for work, I saw one of the other room's doors was partially open. I walked past it and went about my day, but when I got back later that night, it was still open. After some thought, I figured it had to be vacant. I pushed it more open. Inside, the room was dusty and smelled awful. There were webs and stains all over the walls, and it looked like it had been abandoned for years. I stepped out and closed the door, disgusted that there was a room in the building I lived in that looked like that. I went up to my room, but before I walked in, I became curious about the other rooms. I knocked on my neighbor's door, 2A, and nobody answered. I turned the handle, and it was unlocked. When I pushed open the door, the room was the same as the other one, looking to have been abandoned for years. I became really uncomfortable and went back to my room. I contacted the owner, sending him a text asking if any of the other rooms were ready to be rented out. While my room was nice, it felt like I was living alone in an abandoned building, which was really eerie and uncomforting. I waited for the man to respond, but 10 minutes later, I heard the front door to the building open. They walked up to my door and knocked. "Hello, who is it?" I asked before opening the door. They responded, and I recognized their voice as the owner. I opened the door. "I saw your text and thought I'd just come in person," he said, smiling. I nervously smiled back, saying I was just curious about the other rooms. I didn't want to say I went inside them, because I probably wasn't supposed to. He maintained his smile. "Why don't I show you one of the rooms I'm finishing up?" I reluctantly followed him across the hall, but then he stopped by apartment 2A, the room I'd just been in. He pushed open the door and walked in, telling me to come inside and have a look. I stayed, thinking of an excuse, but then he told me again and again, now demanding me to come in. I backed away and ran back to my room, locking the door behind me. I heard him rushing down the stairs and out of the building. After I was sure he left, I started packing up everything, and the next day, I left and never looked back. I never saw that man again, and I never went back to Craigslist for anything. To this day, I still wonder what that building actually was and what the owner was plotting. If I had stepped into that room with him, would I have ever been able to leave?